So, let's go. Number 1. The Gough's Cave, Skull Cups. Picture a cave in the Cheddar Gorge of Somerset, England, 14,700 years ago. The ice is retreating. Reindeer hunters of the Magdalenian culture have walked back into Britain across the land that once joined it to mainland Europe. And inside that cave, they are doing something we still struggle to look at directly. They are taking the heads of their own dead, cutting away the faces, and shaping the rounded tops of the skulls into cups. In 2011, a team led by Sylvia Bello and Chris Stringer at the Natural History Museum in London published the proof in the journal PLOS ONE. These were not accidents of breakage. They were made on purpose. Look closely, and the method is precise. The face and the base of the skull were removed. The broken edges of the brain case were then chipped and retouched, smoothed into a clean rim, until what remained was a bowl. Bello identified at least 3 of these skull cups among the remains of about 5 people. One of them was a child of roughly 3 years old. The bones carry fine cut marks from flint tools, the signatures of scalping, of soft tissue being stripped away, of joints being taken apart by skilled hands. And here is the part that unsettles people most. Human teeth left marks on the other bones. These bodies were not only cleaned, they were eaten. In the same cave lie butchered horses and red deer, processed with exactly the same techniques. So the question becomes sharp. Was this hunger, or was this ceremony? Bello's microscopic work leans toward the second answer. The cup making was careful and standardized, more than mere food processing. A later study in 2015 found a deliberate zigzag pattern engraved on a human forearm bone, a marking that looks like meaning, not butchery. The mainstream reading is a structured mortuary ritual, a way of handling the dead. A more cautious archaeological view allows that ritual and survival cannibalism may have blurred together, and a fringe interpretation casts the cups as trophies taken in conflict. Whatever the truth, this is among the oldest evidence anywhere of humans turning the heads of other humans into objects. And if some early people drank from the dead, others, far away and much later, would give the dead entirely new faces. Number 2. The Plastered Skulls of Jericho. In 1953, the archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon was digging into the Great Mound of Tel es-Sultan, ancient Jericho, one of the oldest continuously inhabited places on Earth. What she found has the power to stop you in your tracks. Human skulls, the flesh long gone, had been carefully remodeled. Someone had built a face back onto the bone using lime plaster, sculpting cheeks and a nose and a brow. Into the empty eye sockets, they had set seashells, cowries, and bivalves, sometimes with a narrow slit to suggest a pupil. These faces date to the pre-pottery Neolithic B period, roughly 7,000 to 9,000 BCE. The process took patience. After death, the body was often buried beneath the floor of the house. Later, the skull was lifted out, and the modeling began. The lower jaw was usually left off, so the work focused on the upper face. Kenyon's first cache held 7 of these skulls. One now rests in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, others in the British Museum and in Jordan. And Jericho was not alone. The same practice appears at Ain Ghazal in Jordan, at Tel Ramad in Syria, at Beisamoun and Kafar HaHoresh, across a wide stretch of the Levant, and across nearly 2,000 years. Why do it at all? The leading interpretation is an ancestor cult. The dead were not gone. They were kept, cared for, displayed within the home, perhaps spoken to. Some skulls carry several layers of plaster, reworked and refreshed over years, as if they were maintained like living members of the household. These are also among the earliest three-dimensional portraits in human history, the first time we tried to fix a human face in sculpture. Modern science has looked inside them. In 2016, the British Museum ran a micro-CT scan of its famous Jericho skull. The scan revealed a cranial cavity packed with soil and a decayed lower jaw hidden under the plaster, and it let forensic artists rebuild the face of the adult male who had lived inside it. The plaster itself was made from burnt limestone, a controlled use of fire and chemistry that predates the invention of pottery. Not everyone received this treatment, which hints at social distinction, at chosen ancestors. The mainstream sees ancestor veneration. Archaeologists emphasize memory and identity. A fringe view wonders if some were enemy skulls, trophies rather than kin. Either way, these people held abstract beliefs about who the dead still were. But did our cousins, the Neanderthals, ever honor their dead at all? Number 3. The Shanidar Flower Burial. High in the Zagros Mountains of Iraqi Kurdistan lies Shanidar Cave. Between 1951 and 1960, the American archaeologist Ralph Solecki excavated there and uncovered the remains of at least 10 Neanderthals. One of them, the adult male known as Shanidar IV, would become the center of one of the longest-running arguments in all of prehistory. When Solecki's colleague Arlette Leroy-Gourhan analyzed the soil around the body, she found unusually high concentrations of pollen from at least 7 flowering plants: yarrow, cornflower, ragwort, grape hyacinth, St. Barnaby's thistle. To Solecki, the message was clear and moving. Around 65,000 to 70,000 years ago, Neanderthals had laid their dead to rest on a bed of wildflowers. He told the story in his 1971 book, Shanidar, The First Flower People. For a moment, the brutish caveman image cracked open, and something tender showed through. Then came the doubt. In 1999, the researcher Jeffrey Sommer offered a deflating explanation. A small burrowing rodent called the Persian Jerd stocks its nests with seeds and flower heads. The pollen, he argued, may have been carried in by animals, not by mourners. The flowers might be an accident of biology. The story did not end there. New excavations resumed at Shanidar in 2014, led by Emma Pomeroy, Graham Barker, and Chris Hunt. Between 2018 and 2020, they uncovered a new articulated Neanderthal skeleton named Shanidar Z, lying close to the original cluster. The pattern suggested the dead had been placed in the same spot, again and again, over time, a chosen place for the dead. And in 2024, a fresh look at the pollen revived the possibility that flowering plants really were involved. There is more here than flowers. Shanidar I, nicknamed Nandi, was an older male with a withered arm, a healed head injury, and likely deafness. He survived for years with these disabilities. Someone helped him. That alone speaks of care within the group. The stakes are enormous. If Neanderthals laid flowers, then symbolic ritual existed in a species that was not us. The mainstream now accepts intentional burial while staying uncertain about the flowers. A skeptical camp holds the pollen as natural. A bolder view imagines a full funeral with offerings. While that debate burns on, no one doubts that the next object was made to carry meaning. Number 4. The Lion Man of Hohlenstein-Stadel. In 1939, just days before the Second World War shut the excavation down, the archaeologist Otto Wölzing pulled fragments of carved mammoth ivory from a cave called Hohlenstein-Stadel in the Lone Valley of southern Germany. The pieces sat forgotten in storage for decades. Then, in 1969, Joachim Hahn began fitting them together and realized he was looking at something impossible. A standing figure, about 31 centimeters tall, with the body of a human and the head of a cave lion. Radiocarbon dating places this lion man at roughly 40,000 years old, in the Aurignacian period. That makes it among the oldest figurative sculptures ever found. And it is more than old. It is the oldest known image of a being that does not exist in nature, a creature half human and half animal, what scholars call a therianthrope. To carve it, someone first had to imagine it. Someone had to hold in their mind a thing that no eye had ever seen. The labor was staggering. The experimental archaeologist Wolf Hein recreated the figure using only a flint tool and estimated it took at least 400 hours of work. 400 hours in a world where every hour not spent finding food was a risk. Between 2008 and 2013, new digs led by Klaus Joachim Kind recovered hundreds more tiny fragments, allowing a fuller reconstruction. The surface shows wear, as if the figure was handled often, perhaps passed from hand to hand in ceremony. It was found deep in the cave, away from the everyday hearths, in a place that feels set apart. This was not a one-off. A smaller lion-headed figure turned up at the nearby cave of Hohlefels, and these same Swabian caves gave us the oldest known musical instruments, flutes of bone and ivory, and the famous Venus of Hohlefels. In 2017, the region was named a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The Lion Man itself sits today in the Museum Ulm. Even its sex is debated. Cave lions lacked the heavy mane of African lions, so some argue the figure is a lioness, or deliberately ambiguous. The mainstream calls it symbolic art. Others see a shamanic or mythic being. A fringe reading calls it an actual deity, the seed of the world's first religion. Whatever it meant, belief was clearly alive 40,000 years ago. And belief also showed in how lavishly the living dressed their dead for the grave. Number 5. The Sunghir Burials. Near the Russian city of Vladimir, about 200 kilometers east of Moscow, lies a site called Sunghir. Starting in 1957, the archaeologist Otto Bader uncovered burials there that rank among the richest of the entire Ice Age. They date to roughly 30,000 to 34,000 years ago. The most famous are an adult male and, nearby, 2 children laid head to head. The scale of decoration is almost beyond belief. The bodies were covered in carved beads of mammoth ivory, around 13,000 of them across the burials. Experimental work suggests each bead took roughly an hour to make. Do the arithmetic, and you are looking at tens of thousands of hours of labor sewn onto clothing as ornament for the dead. From the placement of the beads, researchers have reconstructed tailored fur garments, caps, and footwear, an entire wardrobe rendered in ivory. The children's grave held more. Beside them lay spears made from mammoth tusks that had somehow been straightened into long, true shafts, a feat that requires heating or steaming the ivory, and one that modern craftsmen find hard to repeat. There were carved ivory animals, antler batons, discs, and a human thigh bone packed with red ochre. And over everything, the deep red of ochre, the same pigment that haunts prehistoric burials across the world. Then, genetics rewrote the story. In 2017, a study from Eski Villerslev's group analyzed the ancient DNA and found that the individuals were not close relatives. This was not a simple family laid to rest together. The same work showed that the wider population avoided close inbreeding, which implies networks of mate exchange between scattered bands, a social world larger than a single camp. One of the children had bowed, pathological thigh bones, a sign of illness or disability, and yet that child received one of the richest burials ever found. That detail points to ascribed status, the idea that rank could be granted at birth rather than earned. The mainstream sees high-status burials. Archaeologists debate inherited rank. A darker fringe view wonders whether these special children were sacrificed. But ritual was never only about death. Sometimes it cut into the living skull itself. Number 6. Stone Age Trepanation. Trepanation is the act of cutting a hole in the skull of a living person and removing a piece of bone. It is the oldest surgical procedure we know of, and it was being performed across the world more than 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. At Ensisheim in France, one skull, roughly 7,000 years old, shows 2 separate openings, both healed. That word, healed, is the key to everything. When bone is cut and the patient dies, the edges stay sharp. When the patient lives, the bone slowly grows back, rounding and smoothing the rim. Vast numbers of trepanned skulls across Europe and especially in the Andes of Peru show exactly that healing. People survived this. Many survived for years. Studies of Peruvian skulls suggest that success rates actually improved over the centuries, eventually beating the survival rates of cranial surgery during the American Civil War, thousands of years later. The techniques varied. Some surgeons scraped the bone away. Some cut a circular groove. Some drilled a ring of small holes and joined them. Some cut a neat rectangle. The tools were flint and obsidian, and later bronze. In the Andes, surgeons may have eased the ordeal with coca leaves, both anesthetic and stimulant. The patients were often warriors with fractured skulls from slingstones and clubs, which suggests a real medical purpose, relieving pressure and removing splinters. But medicine is not the whole story. Some openings sit far from any injury. The bone discs cut from the skull, called rondelles, were sometimes pierced and worn as amulets, charms carrying a piece of the operation with them. Proposed motives stretch from treating headaches and epilepsy to releasing evil spirits or unseen pressure from the head. The French physician Paul Broca pioneered the scientific study of these skulls in the 1860s and 1870s, and the questions he raised are still open. The truly astonishing thing is how widespread it was. Trepanation appears, independently, on nearly every inhabited continent. It is one of the few near-universal practices of the prehistoric world. The mainstream sees medical intervention. A middle view sees medicine and ritual fused. A fringe reading sees a deliberate attempt to alter consciousness. Modern surgeons still drill burr holes to relieve pressure on the brain, a direct descendant of this Stone Age act. And while some cultures cut into the living, others did not bury their dead at all. They gave them to the sky. Number 7. The Tomb of the Eagles. On the island of South Ronaldsay, in the Orkney Islands off the north coast of Scotland, a farmer named Ronald Simison went looking for stone to build a fence in 1958. Instead, he found a Neolithic tomb. Inside the chambered cairn at his Bister, built around 3000 BCE, lay the bones of as many as 340 people. But they were not laid out as whole bodies. They were disarticulated, the bones jumbled and mixed together, separated long after death. That mixing tells a story. Before the bones reached the tomb, the bodies were left out in the open to decompose, a practice called excarnation. Only later, once the flesh was gone, were the cleaned bones gathered and placed inside. Skulls were often set apart, arranged along shelves, and tucked into side cells of the flagstone chamber. The dead became part of a communal collection, an ossuary, where individual identity dissolved into a shared ancestral mass. And then, there are the eagles. Among the human remains, excavators found around 70 talons and bones of the white-tailed sea eagle, Britain's largest bird of prey, with a wingspan over 2 meters. The bird gave the tomb its modern name, and it raises a haunting possibility. The eagle may have been a totem, a clan symbol, the spirit animal of these people. Some researchers picture sky burial in the most literal sense, the bodies exposed and the great birds descending. Others, after later dating of the eagle bones, argue the birds were deposited over a long span as offerings rather than active scavengers. The human bones themselves describe hard lives, arthritis, healed fractures, worn teeth, short lifespans. This was Neolithic Orkney, a surprisingly dense center of ritual life that also gave us the village of Skara Brae, the tomb of Maeshowe, and the ring of Brodgar. Excarnation and the curation of cleaned bones were widespread across the British Neolithic, but few sites tie a single animal so tightly to the dead. The mainstream reads excarnation plus a totem bird. Archaeologists emphasize collective ancestor curation over the individual. A fringe view imagines a full sky burial death cult with living eagles feeding on the dead. For decades, the Simison family ran the site as their own private museum, a rare story of a farmer guarding the bones he found. And long before Orkney, in a Welsh cave, a single body had been painted for eternity. Number 8. The Red Lady of Paviland. In 1823, the Oxford geologist and clergyman William Buckland climbed down into Goat's Hole Cave on the Gower Peninsula of South Wales. There, he excavated a human skeleton, in what is often called the first systematic excavation of a human burial anywhere. The bones were stained a deep red, and they lay with ornaments, so Buckland decided this must be a Roman-era woman, perhaps a prostitute, and named her the Red Lady of Paviland. He was wrong on nearly every count. The skeleton is a young man, and he is far, far older than Rome. Modern radiocarbon dating places the burial at about 33,000 to 34,000 years old, deep in the Upper Paleolithic. That makes the Red Lady the oldest known ceremonial burial in all of Western Europe. At the time, this cave did not look out over the sea. It overlooked a cold, open plain, now drowned beneath the waves, roamed by Ice Age animals. The red was the point. The bones had been deliberately stained with red ochre, an iron oxide pigment ground and applied to the body. Beside him lay grave goods, perforated periwinkle shells and rods and rings carved from mammoth ivory. A mammoth skull was reportedly found nearby, perhaps marking the grave. Isotope analysis of the bones suggests a diet rich in animal and marine protein, and that the man was around 21 years old at death, and physically strong. Why ochre? The answer is one of the great threads of this whole story. Red ochre burials appear again and again across the prehistoric world, from Wales to Russia to Australia, among peoples who had no contact with one another. The color seems to have carried shared meaning. Perhaps blood, perhaps life, perhaps the boundary between the living and the dead. We infer the meaning. We cannot confirm it. Buckland, who believed in a young earth shaped by a biblical flood, struggled to fit this ancient man into his timeline at all. The skeleton now rests in the Oxford University Museum of Natural History, and the name Red Lady has stuck, despite the correction, a fossil of the history of science itself. The mainstream reads symbolic burial. Archaeologists stress the meaning of ochre. A fringe view casts him as a shaman or special figure. These, though, were scattered acts by small bands. Soon, people would build a place dedicated to ritual itself. Number 9. Göbekli Tepe. On a dry hilltop near Şanlıurfa in southeastern Turkey stands a site that forced archaeologists to rewrite the story of civilization. Beginning in 1995, the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt excavated Göbekli Tepe and found enormous circular enclosures, ringed by massive T-shaped pillars of limestone. The oldest layers date to roughly 9,600 to 8,200 BCE, about 11,600 years ago. That is around 6,000 years before Stonehenge, and thousands of years before the invention of writing or metal. The pillars are immense. The tallest reach about 5.5 meters and weigh up to 10 to 16 tons, quarried, carved, and hauled into place by people who had no metal tools, no wheel, and no draft animals. Many are carved in relief with wild creatures, foxes and boars, snakes and scorpions and vultures. The T-shaped pillars themselves seem to be stylized human figures, some with carved arms, hands, and belts, silent stone beings standing in a ring. Here is what shattered the textbooks. Göbekli Tepe was built by hunter-gatherers, not by farmers. For a century, scholars had assumed that monumental religion required agriculture first, that you needed settled farms and surplus food before you could build temples. Schmidt argued the opposite. He called Göbekli Tepe the world's first temple, a ritual center raised by people who still lived by hunting and gathering, and he proposed something even bolder. Perhaps the need to feed the crowds who gathered here is what drove people to domesticate plants in the first place. Wild einkorn wheat, the ancestor of farmed wheat, grows on the nearby hills. The ritual may have come first, and farming followed to support it. There is evidence of feasting on a huge scale, masses of gazelle and aurochs bone, and possible stone vats for brewing. After generations of use, the enclosures were deliberately backfilled and buried, which is why they survived so well. Schmidt died in 2014, and the work continues, now revealing that some structures may have had domestic uses too, complicating the pure temple idea. Nearby sites like Karahan Tepe form a whole landscape of these early monuments. One carved pillar has been linked, controversially, to astronomy. In 2018, the site became a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and ground-penetrating radar shows many more enclosures still buried. The mainstream calls it a ritual center, others a multi-use gathering place, and fringe voices spin lost civilization tales. The same impulse that raised this hill would one day raise the most famous ritual monument on Earth. Number 10. Stonehenge and the Durrington Walls Midwinter Feasts. Everyone knows Stonehenge. Far fewer know that it was the hub of a vast gathering of the living. On Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire, England, the Great Stone Circle took its main shape between roughly 3000 and 2000 BCE. It is aligned with the sky, so that the setting sun of the midwinter solstice and the rising sun of midsummer frame its central axis. The largest sarsen stones weigh up to about 25 tons and were dragged some 25 kilometers from the Marlborough Downs. The smaller blue stones, 2 to 5 tons each, were somehow moved around 250 kilometers from the Preseli Hills of West Wales. About 3 kilometers away lies Durrington Walls, a huge henge that turned out to be the largest known Neolithic settlement in Britain. Between 2003 and 2009, Mike Parker Pearson and the Stonehenge Riverside Project excavated there and found houses and enormous heaps of feasting debris. When they studied the pig teeth and bones, a pattern emerged. Many of the animals had been slaughtered in midwinter, around the December solstice. People were coming here to feast at the turning of the year, and they came from astonishingly far. Isotope analysis of the pigs and cattle showed that the animals had been raised all across Britain, some as far away as Scotland, then brought to this one place. This was an early pilgrimage, hundreds of kilometers on foot, converging on Salisbury Plain for a shared midwinter rite. The pigs were often killed young, and some had been shot with arrows, hinting at a ritual element to the slaughter itself. Parker Pearson proposed a powerful idea. Durrington, built of wood and full of feasting, was the land of the living. Stonehenge, built of enduring stone, was the domain of the dead. The two were linked by the River Avon and by ceremonial avenues, paths for processions between life and death. And Stonehenge truly was a place of the dead. In its early phase, it served as a cremation cemetery, holding the burnt remains of dozens of people. Recent isotope work on those cremated bones has linked some of the dead to West Wales, the very region the bluestones came from. The midwinter focus suggests a concern with the rebirth of the sun and the renewal of the year. The monument was built and rebuilt over more than 1,000 years, its stones joined with carpentry techniques, rendered in rock, mortise and tenon, and tongue and groove. The mainstream reads a solar temple and cemetery. Archaeologists describe a landscape of the living and the dead. Fringe voices imagine an astronomical computer or a center of healing. Together, Stonehenge and Durrington Walls give us the richest evidence in Europe of communal ritual driven by the calendar, long before written history. Step back from these 10 cases, and patterns begin to surface, the same motifs rising again and again among people who never met. The clearest is red ochre. It stains the Red Lady of Paviland. It covers the dead at Sunghir, and it appears in burials from Australia to the Americas. The choice of this iron-rich red, across continents and across tens of thousands of years, suggests it meant something profound, perhaps blood and life, perhaps the passage into death. We cannot read the thought directly. we can only see that the thought was shared. The head is another thread. The brain cases of Gough's cave became cups. The skulls of Jericho became portraits. The skulls of Orkney were set apart on shelves, and trepanation cut directly into the living head. Across all these unconnected cultures, the head was treated as the seat of identity, the part of a person worth keeping, remaking, or opening. Closely tied to this is the curation of the dead, the keeping and cleaning and arranging of bones, the refusal to simply let the body vanish. Animals carry meaning too. The cave lion fused with a human in the Lion Man. The vulture and the fox watched from the pillars of Göbekli Tepe. The eagle presided over the dead of Orkney, and feasting binds groups together, the aurochs of Göbekli Tepe and the midwinter pigs of Durrington, food as the glue of community. Again and again, we see enormous labor poured into things with no practical use. 13,000 beads, 16-ton pillars, stones hauled from Wales, all in the service of belief. Some of this ritual reaches for the sky, aligning monuments to the solstices and anchoring human life to cosmic time. The geographic spread is total. Britain, Iraq, Germany, Russia, Turkey, the Andes. The time depth runs from the 70,000-year-old grave at Shanidar to the 4,000-year-old stones of Salisbury Plain. And the trend over those tens of millennia moves from private acts, a painted body, a carved figure, toward communal architecture, temples and henges built by crowds. The mainstream reads this as convergent symbolic cognition, the same human mind reaching the same answers. Archaeologists point to shared environmental triggers. A fringe view dreams of a single lost origin, which leaves the deepest question of all. Why does ritual appear at all, before anyone could write it down? Writing is young. The first true scripts appear in Mesopotamia only around 3,400 to 3,200 BCE. Nearly everything in this video is older, much of it tens of thousands of years older. The Lion Man predates the first written word by some 35,000 years. So for almost the entire span of the human story, people built meaning without a single written record. Ritual was how they did it. The roots run deep. Long before any of these monuments, people at Blombos Cave in South Africa were engraving patterns into ochre around 75,000 years ago and stringing shell beads. The symbolic mind was already awake. What ritual added was a way to carry that mind forward, through time without paper or ink. A ceremony performed the same way each year, in the same place, becomes a living library. Memory specialists, elders, and oral tradition held the knowledge, and the repetition fixed it. Place mattered enormously. The Neanderthals returned to the same spot in Shanidar Cave. The people of Orkney brought their dead, again and again, to the same tomb. The crowds came back to the same hill at Göbekli Tepe and the same plain at Stonehenge. Returning to a place, performing the same acts, is how a society without writing remembers who it is. There is a social engine here too. The genetics at Sunghir showed people who were not close kin and who avoided inbreeding, which means bands were cooperating across distances. Ritual is the technology that lets unrelated people trust and bond. The huge labor of a burial or a monument works as a costly signal, proof of commitment that holds a group together. This may be why ritual gathering at Göbekli Tepe seems to come before farming, rather than after it. The drive to come together and believe may have helped invent settled life. All of this unfolds against a changing world, the end of the Ice Age, the warming Holocene, growing populations, and the first permanent settlements, each creating new needs for shared identity. And death sits at the center of every case, the universal prompt that makes humans stop and act with intention. Yet, we must be humble. Only durable ritual survives, the ivory and the stone and the bone. Whole worlds of song, dance, and spoken belief have vanished without a trace. For all we have reconstructed, vast stretches of these beliefs remain unreadable. Honesty demands that we name the gaps, and they are wide. We do not know whether the cannibalism at Gough's cave was driven by warfare, by famine, or by pure ritual. We do not know, after 70 years of argument, whether the Neanderthals of Shanidar truly laid flowers, or whether a burrowing rodent fooled us all. We cannot say for certain whether we are reading real funerals in their graves or projecting our own feelings onto them. The Lion Man guards its secret too. Was it a deity, a spirit, a character in a story, or a marker of status? We will likely never know. The richly buried children of Sunghir pose a darker question. Why such wealth for the young, and were they honored or sacrificed? Most trepanations leave us guessing whether the goal was to heal a wound or to release a spirit. On Orkney, we cannot be sure whether living eagles tore at the dead or whether their bones were laid down as quiet offerings. Göbekli Tepe overflows with riddles. What did the carved foxes and vultures and snakes mean to the people who raised them? And why, after all that labor, did they deliberately bury the whole complex? At Stonehenge, the exact astronomical knowledge, if any, remains contested, and the means of moving the bluestones 250 kilometers from Wales is still argued over. The lavish burials at Sunghir may or may not prove that inherited rank existed. The meaning of red ochre is inferred everywhere and confirmed nowhere. Above all, we cannot recover the inner lives, the emotions, fears, and hopes behind these acts. We cannot know the specialists who performed them, the surgeons and plasterers and carvers, or how their roles connected to early power and leadership. 3 responses meet these gaps. The mainstream stays cautious, refusing to claim more than the evidence allows. Archaeologists reconstruct carefully, building the best supported story, and a fringe rushes to fill the silence with lost civilizations and ancient aliens. The honest answer is that much is simply unknown. But new science keeps narrowing those gaps, faster now than ever before. The tools that crack these mysteries open are dazzling. The revolution in ancient DNA, led by labs like those of David Reich and Eski Villerslev, gave us the Sunghir genomes and the shock that the buried were not kin. Strontium and oxygen isotopes, locked into teeth and bone, let researchers trace where a person or a pig was raised, which is how we learned that the Durrington feasters came from across Britain and that some of Stonehenge's cremated dead came from Wales. Other methods reach inside without destroying. Micro-CT scanning let the British Museum peer into the Jericho skull and rebuild its face. Refined radiocarbon dating, pioneered by scientists like Thomas Hyam, corrected the age of the Red Lady of Paviland and many others. Experimental archaeology puts the labor in human terms. Wolf Hine spending 400 hours recarving the Lion Man, and others recreating the ivory beads of Sunghir to count the hours they cost. The Shanidar pollen was re-examined with modern techniques as recently as 2024, and sediment micromorphology now tests whether grave pits were truly dug on purpose. Proteins and the hardened plaque on ancient teeth reveal old diets and feasts. Ground-penetrating radar maps the unexcavated enclosures still hidden under Göbekli Tepe. Forensic facial reconstruction brings Neolithic people back to us, eye to eye. Use-wear analysis under the microscope separates butchery from ritual marking on the bones of Gough's cave. Even modern medicine is part of the thread. The craniotomy a neurosurgeon performs today, drilling to relieve pressure on the brain, is the direct descendant of Stone Age trepanation. Three-dimensional modeling reassembles shattered artifacts on screen, and museum CT databases open old collections to new eyes. With all of it comes a duty, the ethics of studying and displaying real human remains. Real people who once mourned and were mourned. The same data can serve careful science or be twisted by fringe storytellers. And what all this science circles back to is a single, very human question. These were the first ones, the first people to insist that death meant something, the first to remake a face in plaster, to paint a body in red, to carve a being that had never walked the earth. Strip away the millennia, and what remains is startlingly familiar. The refusal to let the dead simply disappear. The urge to mark the great moments of life with ceremony and care. Ritual is humanity's oldest technology of meaning. It is older than farming, older than metal, older than the written word by tens of thousands of years. A modern funeral and the 70,000-year-old grave at Shanidar are bound by the same thread. Every case in this story shows people planning for something beyond survival, spending hours and lives and mountains of labor on the invisible. And there is a clear arc. The earliest acts are private and small, a single body in a Welsh cave, a figurine deep in a German cavern. Over time, they swell into something collective, crowds traveling across Britain to feast at Midwinter, hunter-gatherers raising 16-ton pillars on a Turkish hill. Belief learned to organize labor on a colossal scale, and in doing so, it built the cooperation that made civilization itself possible. The word prehistoric does not mean primitive in thought. These were minds as capable as ours, reaching for the same things. We read those minds only through bone and stone and ochre, dimly, across an immense gulf of time. We will never hear their songs or learn the names of their gods, but we can see the skull shaped into a cup, the flower that may have rested on a grave, the bones painted red for a journey we cannot follow. That impulse to make meaning in the face of death is perhaps what made us recognizably human in the first place. So keep wondering about the people who came before every record, who left no words at all, and who still managed to tell us the most important thing about themselves. They were here. They cared. And against the dark, before anyone could write a single line, they were the first ones to believe.